morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all here to our Sunday lecture. And first, let me thank the choir for a wonderful start to what I know is going to be a very interesting hour or so. My name is Lauren Kalmus, and I'm here on behalf of the Capital Campaign of the Synagogue to welcome you today. My colleagues Talia Schaefer and Heidi Lerner are out here somewhere. And we couldn't think of a better way to kick off phase 2 of the campaign to restore this beautiful building, the Star of Israel building, than to invite you here to the sanctuary. Because today we're not going to be talking about a holiday or a ritual or a service, but we're going to be talking about this building, this very special sanctuary where we celebrate so many important life events and holidays. So we have an incredible speaker today that I know is going to bring a lot of color commentary and narrative to this building. And so I'm going to ask your indulgence for the next 45 minutes. I'm going to ask the rabbi to come up and to share a few thoughts with us. And then we'll get on with the rest of the program with our honored guest, Dr. Mann. And then the program will finish up with some thoughts and comments from Ken Chef about the plans for the rest of the restoration of this building. So thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you. We're especially grateful to Lauren, together with Heidi and Talia and Ken, for organizing our program today. And it often happens that I have the privilege of taking people on tours of this building or to see them as they walk into this building when they're attending a life cycle event. And the first time they see, when they walk in the doors, they look at the ark, and very often their jaws drop open and they say things like, I can't believe this building is still here. And it is actually amazing that this building is still here. Or they say, this looks just like my grandfather's synagogue in the Bronx. So they say, how old is this synagogue anyway? And it's just so clear that our ark is one of those features that is especially distinctive and beautiful about our building and about our community. In just a moment, it'll be my privilege to invite Dr. Vivian Mann to share with us help us to better understand the history of arks in synagogues and help us thereby to better understand the significance of our own ark. I want to share two quick thoughts though first. For about 20 years, our community has had a rather distinctive custom that on Shabbat mornings, we have young children up to about age 8 who follow along in the Torah procession as we return the Torah to the ark, and then they come up on the bima and then they kiss the Torahs as the Torahs are being put away. And when I'm looking for one image that exemplifies the spirit of our community, both our commitment to education and then also our blending of old and new and our blending of youth and history, this is the image that I often return to. The image of very young children standing in front of this historic ark as an expression of this community's commitment to bring the teachings of the Torah into the lives of people all across the age spectrum. So a couple of years ago, I did some research on this custom, expecting that I would find that it originated maybe in the Chavurah movement in the 1960s in Boston or something like that. And to my surprise, I found out that this custom actually dates from 14th century BC. That there's a scholar there who wrote a halachic work called the Orza Ruah, in which he encourages synagogues to invite young children to come up to kiss the Torah scroll shortly after the Torah reading. So I don't know if my predecessors in Hoboken who originated this custom here were simply adapting the custom of the Orza Ruah from Vienna in the 14th century, or if this is simply a case of great minds thinking alike. Either way, it reminds us that one of the ways that we demonstrate devotion to something is by how we package it, how we encase it, and the degree of respect that we give to it in a communal setting. And Jews have put sacred scriptures into arks for almost as long as the Jewish people have been around. And it all goes back to the very first sacred scripture, which is, of course, the tablets of the Ten Commandments. In the Torah, in the book of Exodus, we read about the original ark, which is the Ark of the Covenant, the Aron HaEdut, that was one of the furnishings of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, that was like the portable sanctuary for the Israelite community in the desert. And we read that inside this ark, this Aron, were to be placed the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. And we also read that there was a covering on top of the ark, which is called the kaporet. And right on top of the kaporet, there were 2 statues. Believe it or not, 2 statues that were mirror images of each other, facing each other. I don't know if this sounds familiar to any of you. 2 statues that are mirror images of each other, facing each other. Whereas we have lions here that may, and we'll get to hear from if this is something that Dr. Mann might agree, might in some way be an adaptation of the Kruvim, these statues that were adorning the kaporet over the ark, the original ark in the tabernacle. But these kruvim, which is how they're described in the Torah, are some kind of winged angelic beings. We don't know much more about them. Except, interestingly, the Talmud suggests that they have the faces of children. So having children in close proximity to the ark is once again not a new thing for our community. And in the Talmud, our sages discuss what it could mean to have these two beings that are facing each other adorning the ark. And one suggestion that is given is that it's a demonstration of the goals of the sacred scriptures that are inside the ark, which is to help God and the people of Israel to have a relationship that would be analogous to a relationship of two friends or two beings that are looking into each other's eyes. And so having the ark in the tabernacle, or even having our ark adorned in this way is a reminder of the purpose of the scriptures that are inside of the ark. It's my honor to welcome Dr. Vivian Mann to address us today. When we came up with the concept for kicking off this phase of our restoration of our synagogue by discussing the ark, Lauren called around to a number of scholars of Jewish art to describe the program that we had in mind, and she received a couple of times the response, this is something that I could do, but really the person you need to have is Dr. Vivian Mann. She's one of the premier historians of Jewish art. She now directs the master's program in Jewish art and visual culture at the Jewish Theological Seminary. For many years, she was the Morris and Eva Feld Chair of Judaica at the Jewish Museum. In that capacity, she produced many exhibitions and their catalogs. She has written a number of books and contributed to many books and journals. Her newest book is Art and Ceremony in Jewish Life, Essays in the History of Jewish Art. And in 2007, she was the founder of the journal Images, a journal of Jewish art and visual culture, which is the first American academic journal for the study of Jewish art. This is also a homecoming of sorts for Dr. Mann, because she grew up in Bayonne, and we're honored now to welcome her back home to Hudson County and to address us this week.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Scheinberg, and I have a few Bayonne. Two friends of my mother are here, so that makes it very special from Bayonne. What I would like to present to you today is the history of the ark, but before that, I think it's necessary to understand a little about the institution of the synagogue, and it's in contrast to the history of the temple, about which we read a great deal yesterday in the Torah reading. The temple in Jerusalem, like other antique temples in Greece, for example, were backdrops for services or for congregations who stood outside of it. The ordinary people did not go into the temple. They only went in, they were allowed into some of the courtyards at specified times, but the temple was for the priests, and only the priests went into the inner sanctuaries. This is some of you may have seen, this was at the former Holy Land Hotel. There was a big model of the city of Jerusalem at the time of the temple. This is the facade of the main building of the temple, and this has now been moved to the Israel Museum. The second thing, so let me just go on with that thought. When synagogues came into being, with the destruction of the temple, and even before, in places that were hard to access the temple, for example, on Masada or on Herodion, there were temples even before the destruction. There were synagogues even before the destruction, because it was difficult for people to get from those places to Jerusalem. Synagogues enclosed the congregation, just as you are sitting here enclosed by these walls. You form, there's a sense of being united by being within the same space with other people. And that type of building, that enclosed activities, can be attributed to the Romans, who created a basilical type building that had aisles, an aisle tall with a larger space in the middle, and then columns and then smaller spaces on the side. So what a synagogue did was to create a sense of community. Now, the service also changed when when the destruction took place and people had to have another place to worship. It no longer was a sacrificial service, but emphasis was given to reading the Torah and to praying within the synagogue. So now the synagogue becomes a place where the Torah needs to be stored. And the question becomes, how do you store a Torah? The Talmud in Masechet Megillah gives 3 ways of storing the Torah. One is to wrap it in a fine cloth. The second is to put it in a bag, like a nice cloth bag. And the third is to put it in an ark. And that's what I want to explore with you today. Judaism differs from the other monotheistic religions in still insisting on writing its sacred scripture as a scroll. We write Torah scrolls. And this is one of those this was the book of Habakkuk, a prophet that was found in Qumran, but it gives you an idea of what an ancient scroll looked like written on parchment. So whereas Christianity and Islam later used the Codex, Judaism has insisted on retaining the scroll form. And originally, the scrolls, the 5 books of the Bibles were each written on separate scrolls, so they were of moderate length, and they had a rod that was in Roman practice. To preserve a scroll, you put a rod through the middle of the scroll so that it couldn't get squished. But later, by the 4th century, all scrolls were written 5 to 1 scroll. That made for an extremely heavy parchment, which was consisted of all these pieces put together and sewn together. As you can see, look at the right and margin, you see the stitching of pieces of parchment together. And that necessitated a different kind of support, as we'll see. So this is an example of the Christian use of the Codex, the book form as we know it today for their Bibles. It's a 6th century Bible. And here are 2 10th, 11th century Qurans that were always written as books, never as a scroll. Some excavations in the place where Bar Kokhba hid from the Romans in Israel yielded containers for scrolls and this piece of textile, which is, I admit to you, was a piece of textile. It may not look like much, but it's really important. It dates 135 to this era, and it was found in the context of jars holding scrolls. So it represents the oldest scroll record that we have. It's the forerunner of the mantle that we use today. And was an example of a precious textile which was put around what was considered to be the Word of God. Now, as far as arks are concerned, they, in some early synagogues, and this is the period, through, let's say, the 5th century, in some early synagogues, the Torah scrolls were not placed in a fixed ark, but in a kind of, I don't know, a wagon with a building on top that you see on the screen. And if you look at it, you see there are columns that denote the size, and the front of it has 4 panels. There's a panel door, and above it is a plipius. This is a scroll shape, or actually the shell shape, that signified immortality in the Roman world. It's the equivalent of a halo. So instead of putting the scrolls in a fixed ark, in some synagogues they were outside the prayer sanctuary. They were brought in for the reading, and then they were taken out again. And probably why this happened synagogues were in the Galilee, in the Galilee. So Jerusalem was south. So the facade of these synagogues were always built facing Jerusalem. And then to figure out how to have the entryway and then the architects would, it didn't always work in their mind. So this may have seemed to be a better solution, though in time it was superseded by having a permanent ark. One of the earliest permanent arks is not in Israel proper. It is in, it was in Syria, in a town called Dura Europos, which was excavated by Yale University in 1930-31. Dura Europos was a caravan town. You know, it was a trading place. So there was a mixed population of Jews, of Parthians, of Roman soldiers, and actually there, Yale found the first known Christian baptistry, and also a Mithraeum, that is a sanctuary to the god Mithras, who was favored by soldiers. But the most spectacular find was this synagogue, which is one of whose walls you see at the left side and a detail of the ark on the right. The synagogue had been built in the street next to the wall. It was really called Wall Street. And when the Parthians came in 245 and conquered the city, they battered down the wall, which fell over. If you can imagine, this is the wall. They battered down the wall, and the wall fell into the synagogue. And it preserved all of these frescoes of biblical scenes until 1931. And now it's they're in the Damascus Museum. But it's a wealth of pictorial art, but we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the art itself, which you see has the Philippius again, and above there's a facade which represents the temple, so the equivalence between the fact that the synagogue is what's called the Mikdash Ma'at, a small temple, and the menorah points to that, and then on the right is the scene of Abraham offering Isaac. Now, for our purposes in Hoboken, this is an extremely wonderful find. It was excavated in the town of Narrowtine, which is also in the Galil, and represents a synagogue that attempted to solve this problem of the relationship between the doors and the ark by placing on the right side of the doors, as you can see in the drawing, a permanent ark for the Torah. And the actual, because of an earthquake in 304, there are a lot of earthquakes in Galilee, a whole section of this ark was recovered, which you see on the bottom right. And it represents two confronted lions on a gable, with again the Philippius below, and a sort of astral symbol, which is the rosette. So we have here, probably built in the latter part of the 3rd century, a permanent ark with the same iconography that we have in Hoboken and in many parts of the Jewish world. That is, confronted lions that act as guardian figures for the ark. Where does that come from? It's an old Near Eastern tradition to have figures of animals that face one another as guardians. All you have to do is go to the Metropolitan Museum and go to the Assyrian section, and you will see these big animals that were guardian figures. So the idea is an old one. The use of the lions is particularly, the focus is always usually on lions in Jewish art, because the lion occurs in the writings. You know, Judah is a lion as well. There are allusions to lions all over. So this is probably the reason for the genesis of the iconography. But the fact that it has lasted for so many centuries is I think, remarkable. Here's another example in Italy. The Jews came to Italy in the 2nd century before the Common Era. They were sent as emissaries and they went on business. And one of the oldest synagogues is in Ostia, which is the south of Rome, and it's a fabulous site if you are over in Italy. You take the 20-minute bus ride or whatever. So there are many ruins of amphitheaters and other buildings, and then away in the distance you see this building by itself. And probably because the synagogue was built near the river so that the waters could be used for the mikvah. And it was begun in the 1st century of this era. And then in the 4th century, they revised the building to include an ark. So there were the tall columns mark the aisles. So there was an aisle on the left of the column, on the left of the screen, there was an aisle in the middle, and over here was another aisle. And they blocked that off by building a semicircular wall and fronting it with 2 smaller columns and reliefs. So the idea of having a permanent ark for the Torah was something that took time to be established in Israel, and it also took time to be established in Italy, where there was a Jewish population that lasted until today. It has always has continuous life on the Italian peninsula. Now, what these arks in Italian synagogues, early Italian synagogues, look like is indicated by glass that was decorated and placed next to tombs in the catacombs to indicate a person's religion. And here on this one, you can see that there were 3 shelves with cubby holes and 9 scrolls. So this is a depiction of the time when the Torah scroll was still written on individual, each book was written on an individual scroll. And if you look just at the center of the scrolls, you can see maybe a little circle. That's the rod that I was talking about. And there are the 2 lions in the menorah, but the composition is, the designer had to fix the composition into a circular format, and so they're not quite next to the ark. In the Middle Ages, in Ashkenaz, most synagogues were built of stone. And therefore, the arks were fixed into one of the walls of the building. And this is now the oldest extant synagogue in Europe. It's the Altmoischel in Prague, which dates to 1260. There was an earlier synagogue in Worms, where Rashi lived for a time, and that was destroyed on Kristallnacht. So this one is the oldest existing synagogue, and I'll show you a detail of the ark. You can see the way that stone was used to create this approach, these 2 walls, curtains, small walls, showing off the steps, and then you go up, and actually you can just be able to see that there is even carved trees representing the tree of life, which is at the very top. It is now obscured by the valance that is over the ark curtain. So this is typical of Ashkenazi synagogues in Europe. Later Italian synagogues, let's say from the late Middle Ages onward, had wooden arks. And this may have been due to the fact that that Italy was divided until the 19th century into different kingdoms and duchies and principalities of the Vatican and states and so forth. And sometimes a ruler would decide he doesn't want his Jews there anymore. And he would expel the Jews, and then they would just simply cross the border and go to the next place. So we find that most of the arks from this one onward, which is 1488, from Modena, are of wood, and they were portable. And there are a very interesting, for example, there's an interesting text dealing with the fact that an ark that had lions at the feet of it was taken to another place where the rabbis didn't like the fact that there were lions at the feet of it, and there was a whole tussle grew out of this, and this man wrote down, he says, but there were all these other rabbis in the first congregation who who sat there and davened. They had no problem with it for centuries, and finally it was accepted. But this tells you something about what could happen when an ark was moved, but they were moved and they were saved. And this is one that's in the Israel Museum that some of you may know from the Torrio Veneto, and it dates 1701, whereas the other one was a Gothic ark. This is in high Baroque style. In the 19th century, Jews achieved civil emancipation, and they were then free to build large synagogues. In fact, there were many cities that said, you know, the mayors of which said the Jews don't have to hide themselves in small synagogues behind walls. If you've ever been in old synagogues in Europe, usually there's a wall, you got to find your way into the courtyard, then you got to find your way into the synagogue. And they said no. And so Jews began to build on major thoroughfares. And in Florence, synagogue, the Emancipation Synagogue you're looking at now, there was an added reason to build a large synagogue, and that was the fact that Florence was for about 5 years the capital of Italy. By the time they finished building, the capital moved to Rome. But they built a magnificent synagogue, which is decorated with Moorish details and in a Moorish style, because it was decided in the 1830s that Moorish represented the Near East. You know, there was also all this popular enthusiasm because people started publishing books about the Alhambra. Washington Irving, by the way, published a book called Tales of the Alhambra. It's one of the books. And if you ever go up to Tarrytown and visit his home, there are incorporated into the building of that house many details, architectural details that he learned because he lived at the Alhambra Palace for some years. So this was considered to represent, you know, Jewish roots in the Near East, but ironically, just at the time when Jews were being accepted into wider society, they were publicizing themselves as being from somewhere else. I mean, there's an irony to the use of this. But I think that the direct line for the synagogue ark here is in Eastern Europe with a couple of side trips. In Eastern Europe, there were stone synagogues, mostly in the big cities, but in smaller cities there were largely wooden synagogues because of the availability of wood in Russia. And many Jews were wood carvers by profession. Unfortunately, these synagogues were destroyed during the period of the Second World War, so that only a few obscure ones are left. But one of the most brilliant of them, or beautiful too, was this one in Wolpa, W-O-L-P-A, in Poland. And you can see it had a very elaborate facade with these two side porches, and then the entrance, and then the central roof rising above it. So these, because of the wood, these buildings went to a great height. And inside above it, you see the ark. And it's multi-story. First of all, goes all the way up to the ceiling, and has a richness of decor that art historians like to call horror vacui. It's this fear of the empty space, like they just kept piling on detail. And you can see eagles, and there are other animals. As part of this, and sometimes the animals are shown against the foliage. And there are other places, other synagogues, where the animals are almost in the round. They're so hard relief that they're almost in the round. So there was this tradition of wood carving. There was a tradition of having animals on the ark. And you can even see, if you look up at the left there, there seems to be a kind of bird, eagle, on the, almost at the top left. And it's this tradition that was brought to the United States by these people with the great immigration of the 1880s. And for example, this is what's called the Sioux City Ark. It was created in Sioux City, one of two arks that was carved by a cattle driver named Abraham Shulman, that lived between 1852 and 1918. This one is dated 1899. It's in the Jewish Museum. And he did another one, which is still in Sioux City. And you can see the way that he has brought this tradition to America. So he did arks, and he also drove cattle. You see, the situation in New York was a little different. But notice the two lions flanking the blue coat, the tablets of the law, with the eagle above it, okay? And two birds. So that a great deal of this is similar to your ark here, the prominence given to the eagle, the use of two lions as guardian figures, as somebody pointed out to me Thursday night, for the blue coat, which are on the glass windows. Now, closer to home, somewhat, is this ark from Nova Scotia, which all they know is that it was carved by a man named Mr. Cone from Montreal, in Glass Bay, Nova Scotia. And you can see again the central image of the lions guarding the tablets. Also two birds, but otherwise it's pretty much just like furniture posts and balustrades like that. But then there's yours. And the iconographic elements are very similar. But what I'd like to suggest that in a way, the traditional composition has been changed in two ways. First of all, there's an addition of a lot of elements from French decorative art. And these are the wreaths that you see, and those panels to the right and left of the lions. The urn, which is a classical motif that was revived in the 18th century, and swags and drapery. The whole color scheme of this gold against the dark wood. And what I'm showing you on the right of the ark is a Hanukkah lamp that was created in the 19th century somewhere near Gdańsk, Poland. But it has two griffins guarding really an altar, a Roman altar, and the head of Medusa. I mean, what this has to do with Hanukkah is beyond anyone. But notice the color scheme, also the dark and the gold, and this represents the enthusiasm for ancient images and ancient iconography that had to do a great deal. That started in the 18th century with the discovery of the cities buried by Vesuvius in Italy, and second of all by Napoleon's trips to the ancient Near East. And that brought up a whole interest in antiquity. A lot closer to your ark is this one, I think, which was created in Chelsea, Massachusetts in the 1920s in a shul that was called the Orange Street Shari Zion Synagogue. And it was carved by a man named Samuel Katz. And he came from Galicia. So he learned his wood carving techniques there. But you see the lions now flanking the tablets, and then these wonderfully migrated southward. What I want to tell you is that many of these men who created these arcs in the New York area also created carousel horses. Their coming to the United States in the 1880s coincided with a boom in carousels. People just loved them. I love carousels too. But they received many commissions, so they made carousel horses and they made arcs. And they made the lions, so that their skill at making animals was used for the lions on the arcs and for the horses. And so sometimes there are records of these people and their work and their workshops that maybe could be brought to bear on research on this arc. And I think also that if we look at the Hoboken arc, the arc here, is in a sense a deconstruction of the iconography, that it's not just one type composition, but the lines have moved to the side, the loopholes are on glass, and this eagle has come down from the top and is now in the center. And in a way, that's a very modernist way of dealing with all of this. And I'll show you, as a comparison, a synagogue in Milburn that was noteworthy because the architect and the rabbi in 1951, when it was built, decided to ask up-and-coming artists to create commissions for the synagogue. There's now an exhibition at the Jewish Museum with the original artworks that were created by Robert Motherwell, Adolf Gottlieb, and Samuel Ferber. So this is the way the building looks inside, and here is the art curtain that came to the Jewish Museum by accident, and it is the original one that was designed by Adolf Gottlieb and worked by members of the congregation. It's very tall. It's about 12 to 13 feet, and it was created in two panels. And you see what he's done here in 1951 is used a principle he was working with, which were boxes filled with symbols. At the bottom, so you have the menorah, the high priest's mitre, a paw of a lion, and then above it, you see the mane of the lion on the right. So you have the menorah, the high priest's mitre, the paw of the lion, then the mane of the lion. Then down here are the loopholes. The bottom's a Jewish star, and I don't know, a tree, and this is his pun on breastplate for the Torah. Okay, and then there's the sitz, the breastplate that was worn by the high priest over here. And on the top are more classical architectural features that we presume represent the ancient temple of the ancient synagogue. So what he did was take the composition and disarrange its elements and create something symbolic. And in some ways, because of the breadth of this wall behind us, that has happened here. But still, I think it belongs in a very strong tradition of arcs that were known in Europe and then brought to the United States. Thank you.
Is that
pairs of birds. Yes?
I have two questions about the lion. The first one is, I had always thought that the lion was a popular symbol because it's the symbol of the tribe of Judah,
Yes.
and we're all descended from
Yeah.
that. The other question is the position of the lion important? In other words, the lions all seem to be in a similar position, up.
They're protecting
You don't
the
see lions crouching and then no lions rolling over. They all seem to be standing.
No, they're protective figures. They go back to the use of paired animals in ancient Indian art in the second millennium BC, where there was a whole tradition of protection being expressed by paired animals facing each other. And that's what you have, or facing away from just paired animals.
I mean, so they're really, at least partly, upright is
It's a more dominant, it's a, you know, if you were an artist and you had to depict a lion, it's more interesting to show up that way.
The urn and the draperies, those are purely decorative elements?
They're classical motifs that were just popular. They're popular in secular silver, they're popular in Jewish, they're just, yeah.
I think like on gravestones, the urn and the drapery have certain priestly connotations.
No, when it's a picture, it has priestly connotations, because the picture is used by the Levites to wash the hands of the Kohanim. So a Levite will often have a pitcher and basin as his symbol. There was somebody else, yes.
Yes, hi. You mentioned before that there was a transition between creating these in stone and then creating them in wood. And then the reason for creating the wood was so that it would be portable. But obviously, one like this is not in a portable condition. So I'm wondering if when synagogues were constructed to be permanent sites, was there consideration for building the arks in any other?
You're mixing countries. When I talked about the portability of ours, that was Italy, where there were always, from the medieval times on to the 19th century, there were always expulsions. Like one day, the Pope gets up in a bad mood and he says, I want to move the Jews out and make mistakes. Okay? And they have to leave the papal states. And they took their most valuable things with them, and the ark was very often the most valuable things. The other ones, these also out of the woods, but these are in places where Jews lived for a long time. I mean, they came to Poland in large numbers from Germany in the 16th century, also because of expulsions. And the Poles welcomed them because they needed the skills that Jews could bring, and had at least lands to settle and so forth. So they expected to be there. So they built wars.
But did they ever consider using any other material?
No, because this was the main, in Russia, there's so much wood that it was used for palaces. I mean, they were not built of stone. It's not that this was poor man's architecture. This was often the same architecture as the churches. In fact, I read a lot of accounts where Jews seem apologetic about the fact that their synagogue from the outside looked exactly like the church in the same town. And they would make up these sort of bubblemises about, that the count, the one with Shtetl, woke up, I had a bad dream, and he woke up and decided he was going to build both the church and the synagogue, and he had the same architect. But they needed to sort of rationalize why they all looked alike. But the point of the story, and your question is similar, is that most important buildings were made of wood. Yeah.
I have two questions. Do we have good suggestions about why Jews kept on using scrolls rather than the codex, especially when the codex seems more useful? It really seems like a technological advance of the scroll.
I should be asking you that.
I mean, I can tell you what I often say when people ask this question to me, but I don't know if I'm right.
I have an art historical answer, but I think it's simply sometimes they're made special. In the 50s, for example, when Vivian Mann and Moshe Sabari were in the workshop at the Jewish Museum, they made, you know, and today, and through today, you get eternal lights that have letters, Hebrew letters, or forms of Hebrew letters. But before that, it was just a hanging lamp. And I don't see, when you go to Italy, I don't see the difference between the lamps hanging in the synagogue and the lamps hanging in the church next door. Long. Yeah. Yes.
Those early arcs, which were arches built into the wall, remind me of a little bit I've seen of the spaces for the Quran in mosques also.
There are no spaces for Quran in mosques. There is a mihrab, which is a niche that indicates the direction of Mecca. There's nothing in it. And it's, that's all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there something in the back?
Dr. Mann, the Ark in Nova Scotia, if you brought that image back up, the tapestry looks almost